The Newsagents.
It is Friday, and it is our very special or bog standard Q&A. It's very special for me because it's the last one that I'm going to do.
Where are you going?
I'm going away.
Where?
Get out your violin.
Small one.
Get out your tiny violin. I'm going on holiday.
Oh, nice.
Yes, I will not be here, but I will be talking about the US once a week with
Very
you.
good. Very good. Well, I hope you have a lovely holiday, Maitlis.
Thank you very much.
It's been quite a run the past few weeks. Are you going to ask a question?
Yes, this is the first question. With the UK election now over, what would you say is the most interesting election coming up over the next 6 to 12 months? And you can't say the US. Spoil sport, Claire, but we can't say the US.
Well, so Claire, I've done my research and I can tell you the elections, and I'm not getting ever so tickled by any of them. We've got Azerbaijan, Algeria, Jordan, Romania, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, Mozambique, and that's all before October. We go on to Lithuania, Moldova, Iraq, regional elections, Georgia. Now, Georgia will be interesting. And then we've got Uzbekistan. I mean, can I get worked up about who's going to be ruling in Tashkent after the Uzbek elections? I'm struggling with it. We also have Uruguay, Chad, Guinea-Bissau, Romania, Namibia, I've said Romania, can't say that twice, Ghana and South Sudan. That's all between now and Christmas.
OK, I'm going to start with what's happening in October, which is the Moldovan one, which I think is fascinating because it has a pre-EU government. And recently, Canada and the UK have warned that Russia is trying to interfere. Where have you heard that before? Russia is trying to make it a Soviet satellite, kick out the EU, bring in somebody who looks more Putin friendly, and this is going to be a big test for Moldova, whether it pulls towards the EU now or whether it is pulled back through disinformation into Russia's orbit. So I think that's an interesting one to look at. I would also say that Canada, don't worry about the US for now, but think about Canada for a moment, because Trudeau, who has been that golden boy, who was the one sort of hailed as part of, the new look politics when he came to power, is incredibly unpopular now. And the Tories there, Canadian Tories, will probably win a landslide unless he does a Biden and he walks before the election. And that would be a pretty interesting thing to watch. So my vote, I'm going to leave you to the Tashkents, to the Stans, as we call them, and say, look at Moldova, look at Canada.
Maitlis, do you have any family members who might be studying in Canada?
And going to Moldova? Maybe. I couldn't possibly comment.
I just wondered whether there was a tiny degree of self-interest about
I'm
where you would like to be on a flight to.
I'm a Canadian. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Jon.
It's Emily.
For one day only.
For one last day.
How am I going to survive the next 4 weeks without you around here making everyone's life? With Lewis and no Snoopy. I mean, it's going to be very odd, very odd. Right, let us get underway. Matt Greenwood asks this question. Andrea Leadsam's leadership run against Theresa May largely failed because of her interview comments criticising Theresa May for not having children of her own. Why was that so terminal for her campaign when Vance seems to be still embraced in the US? Well, it's a really interesting question, Matt, because I would say that actually the embrace of JD Vance by Donald Trump has got a little more tenuous since those comments came to light, and also caused so many problems and have, spawned dozens of memes and has created a sort of pop culture backlash against him. And I wonder whether it's not as fatal as it was for Andrea Leadsom, but I wonder whether there is a slow poisoning of the well taking place with JD Vance as the VP pick.
I think when Andrea Leadsom made those comments, it was so counter to how most people felt about Theresa May and whether or not she had children. It was a really below the belt sort of attack. And I hope it makes us a much more tolerant and a much kinder country, actually, quite simply, because I don't think we ever want to be a nation that penalises or even judges women or men who do or don't have children. But I think America is different because it has been on a very different trajectory for certainly the last couple of years, and you might want to say, 4 decades, which is this whole question of women's reproductive rights and whether they belong to the government. And I think the overturning of Roe v. Wade basically told women in America that they do not have choice anymore, that their choice does not come first. And I think Vance is kind of reaffirming that women should be having children for the sake of the nation. The Great Replacement Theory talks about the importance of having American children. And I think he adheres to that. You have American children so that, immigrants can't take over your country. And there is something in it. When you describe politicians as family friendly, there's always that slight sort of stickiness to it, isn't it? It makes you kind of go, what are you really saying? Because it's lovely that you love your family. We all want to love our families, whatever shape or style or combination that family is. But when you talk about family-friendly politicians in the US, normally it means exerting a level of control over what women can or can't do. And thank God we're not there yet.
Well, where you've ended up is exactly what I wanted to pick up on, which is, when you do the compare and contrast the UK to the US, I feel such a relief that there are not culture wars.
Are we still Strangerland, or are you happy to be home?
I'm happy to be home, frankly, on this one, where you're not having culture wars over abortion. Yeah. You're not having absurd battles in some places where they are trying to ban IVF.
They're literally throwing away women's eggs because they're saying you've got to have 15, babies if you have 15 eggs fertilised.
Exactly. And so some of the debate that has taken place in America seems so detached from ordinary people's reality. And it is mainly men who are pushing an agenda that controls women. And I just feel, thank God, that broadly speaking, in Western Europe and certainly the UK, that is not a debate we are having here.
Has that settled it for you, Matt? We are moving on. Okay, next question is from Jose Ramos. This is a very topical one over the last couple of days. And Jose is asking, hi, newsagents. Question from a fellow journalist here and listener since day one. Could you address whether the newest revelations on Huw Edwards, the BBC presenter, and his guilty plea, this was over pictures of children found on his phone, will vindicate The Sun after the backlash it received when it first broke the story? Will this fuel more stories like this in our tabloid newspaper? Many thanks. Well, I think that's a really interesting place to start, Jose. I do think it will fuel more stories like this. And I do think The Sun will feel incredibly vindicated. This doesn't change a couple of facts, which is worth bringing in. The first is that this investigation, which led to the charges and to the guilty plea, which we heard from Huw Edwards a couple of days ago, was weirdly nothing to do, in criminal terms and police terms, with the last allegation about Edwards paying thousands of pounds for teenage pictures. In fact, the reason that Edwards was arrested last November was because police went through the phone of a now convicted paedophile and found the pictures that had been exchanged between those two men. Nevertheless, look, I think it's pretty hard to argue now that there wasn't a pattern of behaviour emerging there that The Sun were told of from the parents of the boy they spoke to. But I think the other thing that I'd say is that there is, and there should be, a presumption of innocence in this country. And you would assume journalists and broadcasters and the public would adhere to that and would cherish that. And the police investigation at the time found no evidence of criminal behaviour after The Sun published their accusations. And I think it's worth remembering that the same people who, are calling Huw Edwards a nonce and called him a nonce back then were the same people furious with the BBC for sending a helicopter over Cliff Richard's house after there were allegations that he was also a paedophile. And I think it's just worth trying to balance that out, that from what we know now, everything that we know now, and we've had a guilty plea, it is unforgivable. It is appalling. And there are many people in the BBC and more widely his colleagues who feel absolutely let down and horrified by that. But I think if you want ours to be a society in which you presume innocence first, you have to make that applicable across the board.
Obviously, we must say, in the context of the allegations about Cliff Richard, that there were no charges
absolutely
ever brought.
None. And the BBC was basically
absolutely vilified
for,
for its invasion of his privacy in subsequent court cases brought by Cliff Richard against the BBC. On the presumption of innocence, of course, when we kind of did the podcast last July, and said offered words of support towards Huw Edwards, it was in the context that the Metropolitan Police had come out and said there was no criminality, in which case you were kind of saying things like, well, okay, if there is no criminality, then it's someone who's got a messy private life, and it should be for his family members to work out. Obviously, now with hindsight, which is a beautiful and wonderful thing, a year on, and Huw Edwards having pleaded guilty, I know that an awful lot of people who rallied round or who had worked with him, like I had, feel a sense of betrayal, amazement, depression, astonishment, disgust, whatever you want to say, about what was on his phone and what he had pleaded guilty to. Could anyone have seen that was coming? I mean, honestly, I don't know anyone anywhere, from Huw's worst detractors to his greatest fans, who would have said that this was in any way going to be on the cards. We are where we are. And on the presumption of innocence, it goes to the heart of the controversy that there is now around the Director General of the BBC and the staff closest to him, about why was it that the BBC carried on paying him, even though there were a handful of people, maybe smaller than a handful of people, who knew that Huw had been arrested in November. And I know there are strenuous arguments taking place in the BBC from some who think the BBC could do nothing else but to say, we can't stop his pay, we can't presume his guilt when there have been no charges laid against him, to the other people at the top of the BBC who think they've made a catastrophic error, that once you knew that he had been arrested on serious offences, the BBC should have said, goodbye, you're gone, we're not paying you for another second longer.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole question of, if you presume innocence, does that take you to the point of somebody being arrested, or to the point of being charged, or not until you get the guilty plea? Because actually, the guilty plea only came this week. So they'd already fired him. They could already have made the decision that he had now crossed the line. And I think that's probably something that the BBC are arguing over as we speak.
As I say, I think there is considerable consternation at the top of the BBC about those who were in the know and made the decision, and those who knew nothing about the arrest, and suddenly realising in the last 48 hours, oh my God, you knew this and we didn't know about it, and we were kind of proceeding on that basis. So I think there is serious concern. But it does make sense of something else, which we discussed in April, when the resignation statement came out from Huw, which made it look like he had left on his own terms. And we said there must be more to this than meets the eye, because it was such a brusque statement from the BBC with no word of thanks for the 40 years of coverage. And you kept on thinking there is another shoe to drop, as they say in America. And that
something doesn't add up.
Something doesn't add up here. Yeah. And now we see why. That Huw had images of a child, video of a 7-year-old and possibly a 9-year-old on his phone. It does not bear thinking about. It is appalling.
Nick Moon's question, I think, follows on from that. Another one on Huw Edwards. As an employer, I am sympathetic to contracts, but why isn't there a clause to claw back salary or bonus when found guilty of criminality, etc.? Because Huw Edwards was in the list as having been one of the highest paid newsreaders at the BBC, and he got a bonus of some £40,000. I mean, the equivalent, to be fair, of 2 people's salaries at the BBC after his work on the coronation of the King. Yeah.
The problem there again, and it goes back to what we were earlier saying, is that if the presumption is of innocence, you carry on paying somebody. But I've never seen a work contract which has a clawback clause if you are found guilty of criminality. Because broadly speaking, there is an assumption that your staff are not going to be found guilty of offences like this. I mean, this is a really extraordinary situation where the face of BBC News is now a convicted sex offender, presumably a paedophile. I don't know what the correct term is, but he had pictures of underage children on his phone.
That we can say now because he has pleaded guilty. I guess the question you're saying, though, is there anything legally that makes him pay back the money? No.
No. £200,000 in the great scheme of things against an income of £3.5 billion, which is what the BBC gets, is neither here nor there. Yeah. However, symbolically, of course it is, you know, the idea that licence payers' money has gone to pay Huw Edwards, given what we now know about him, just seems heinous and unacceptable.
So I guess, you know, the question is, would Huw Edwards choose to come forward and say, I'm going to pay back the money, you know, it doesn't look great? In the wider context, that's probably not what he's thinking about right now. I mean, there are a lot of things that are potentially coming at him now, including potentially a custodial sentence. I don't think people are going to say, oh, on the one hand, you know, he had those pictures, but on the other hand, what a lovely guy, he paid the money back. Nobody's going to be thinking like that anymore.
Huw Edwards' reputation is utterly trashed. There is no comeback from any of this. But the BBC does have reputation management issues to deal with now, and that £200,000 is going to be the subject of intense scrutiny for the days ahead, and no wonder the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, has called Tim Davie, the Director General, in. We will be back after the break with more of your questions.
Right. Dan Cummings has got our next question. Not Dom, but Dan. For those of us enthusiastic to stay up and watch the US election results in November, when will we be seeing the results come in UK time? Well, Dan, the American elections are a thing of joy because they actually work on a very tight timeline. And depending on where you are, which state you're in or which state you're watching, the polls close at certain times because of the hour changes. So I think you get the East Coast first, you get Virginia, and you tend to get the ones on the East. I think Kentucky, one of the first ones at 7 o'clock. And then each hour, and some on the half hour, more polls close until the final ones shut at 11 o'clock, which is California, Oregon, Washington. In other words, 8 hours behind the UK, 3 hours behind the East Coast. And on a clean night, on a clean election night, come 11 o'clock, it's like the transfer window has slammed shut and you know the result. That wasn't the case in 2016.
Yeah, or 2020. Yeah. Because what happens is that the broadcasters are the ones that call the results. So, or the Associated Press. So you will suddenly have ABC are calling Rhode Island for the Democrats. Well, Rhode Island is tiny, and Rhode Island is going to vote Democrat. Or that you will suddenly get, we are calling Kansas for the Republicans. Yes, we know Kansas is going to be Republican because it's never been anything else. All I would say is that the election happens on a Tuesday. We got the result for Pennsylvania, which gave Joe Biden the 270 electoral college votes he needed in 2020. We got that result on Saturday morning.
Yeah. And you'll remember it because, and you should go back and look at this, Kamala Harris is on her Saturday morning run with bodyguards, and she suddenly takes the call. And she stops in the middle of the run. She's kind of punting. She goes, "We did it, Joe!" Doesn't she say that?
Yeah, she did.
We did it. And so that in my head, I remember it was a weekend because I was running at the same time. I was running over the Washington Bridge going up to the zoo. And I remember sort of hearing all these different bits of the election and thinking, that's not the way that you should learn an election result. But the other thing I'd say is that it puts a huge amount of power, responsibility on the broadcasters. Because sometimes you will get one broadcaster calling a state for, one party and one broadcaster calling it for another party, as we saw with Arizona
on election night
with Fox, right?
Yeah, so Fox News called Arizona on Tuesday night for Joe Biden, and Trump world
like a
was
slap
going
in the face. Yeah.
berserk and trying to ring Fox to pull the call because they said it's too close to call. Why are you calling this? Because, of course, it then led to momentum. It led to political shift with the Democrats saying we're going to win, we're going to win, we're going to win. And Trump came out into the White House and declared victory even after that, even though there was no basis from which he could say, I have won.
Yeah.
You know, Rudy Giuliani said, get up on the stage now and say you've won the election.
And we all remember what happened after that. Look, we haven't done that in UK time, but obviously if it's 7 o'clock Virginia, you'll want to be watching midnight. It's the worst time in the world. It's midnight till about 5 or 6, hopefully, and then go to bed.
Just a couple of double espressos.
Exactly.
You will be fine, Dan.
You'll have a lovely time with us.
But also, the other problem we've got is, of course, if it's a repeat of 2020, you're going to have to stay up for something like 96 hours because we're going to have to wait until Saturday to get the result from
Pennsylvania. And if it's a repeat of 2000, you'll have to stay up until
the Supreme
January.
Court. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Good luck with that.
Right. Hannah Lambert has written saying, do you think if the French voting system was based on ours and voting took place on one day, would Le Pen and Bardella have taken victory? Oh, there's an interesting conundrum of a question.
There's too many counterfactuals.
Yeah.
I mean, so interesting, but too many counterfactuals. Do we have the same relationship with the far right as France does? That's one question. Do we have the same parliamentary system? No, we don't. Do we have the same first past the post electoral system? They have PR, so no, we don't. I don't know what to do with that because I just think there are too many different issues. But I think you can say that the reform vote here
has been underrepresented in Parliament, given the number of people who voted for it.
So, well, I was going to say something slightly different, which is I wonder if there is a global flavour to what happens here and in France, to what happens in America and Brazil, to what happens, you know, between Trump and the Philippines. Do not underestimate the fact that there are links and there are spiders' legs between a lot of these movements. You know, I'm not saying that every reform voter watches, you know, in French to see what Jordan Bardella is saying, but I think these things do carry through, particularly within a continent.
The thing I would just finally add to that, Hannah, is that if you listen to Nigel Farage or Richard Tice, they would say that our voting system worked against them.
Yeah.
Because they got 4 million votes and 5 seats, I think. And that therefore, if they had been getting proportionately their share of the vote in seats, they'd have had many, many more seats than that. So I kind of think that actually our parliamentary system, our voting system of first past the post, worked very much against the interests of reform. And you can see it in European elections back in the day when UKIP came, you know, won the election, came top. And did very well because of it.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say is that you're used to seeing coalition governments formed of groupings, you know, sort of parties come together to form a government in a group. What happened in France this time was that they made their groupings before they actually went to the polls. So you had this big staunch of left-wing parties, which had got itself, sort of amassed itself into a group to take on Marine Le Pen's party and the far right. And so they were already positioning themselves not as parties, but as blocks. And I think that was different, yeah.
Let's go on to Gemma's question now. I'd be lost without you, Jon and Emily. Oh, bless you, Gemma. So thank you for helping make sense of the ever-crazy world we live in. My question is Nigel Farage nothing more than a Tommy Robinson in a suit, as Brendan Cox called him following Nigel's distasteful comments on the tragic Southport incident? Or is it more nuanced than that?
Well, on Monday we had Chris Patton calling him Tommy Robinson in a cravat. So I don't know whether he's sort of going up or down. You know, he's in a cravat, he's wearing a suit, variations on a theme here. I think what they're all trying to say is don't be beguiled by the public school education, you know, and the sort of and the forex trading and the love of fine wine that we know Farage has. The people who are calling him out think he's basically, you know, the inciter of a mob in the same way that Tommy Robinson is.
So I would say something slightly different. That I do think that Nigel Farage now has absolute democratic legitimacy because he has won his seat in Clacton-upon-Sea, and, you know, the handful of other, going back to the previous question, the handful of other Reform MPs have a voice in Parliament which is entirely legitimate. Now the question obviously becomes is how are they using their voice and whether it is responsible or not. But, you know, Nigel Farage is a brilliant communicator. He chooses his words with some care. He knows what he is doing. He knows where the line is and tends not to cross it, but walks up to the edge of it and then just takes a couple of steps back. Tommy Robinson, on the other hand, seems to me to be quite happy to be at the forefront of encouraging the mob and is there amongst it. Nigel Farage stands back and is advancing democratic means by which these arguments should be settled. You may not like the arguments, but he's in a very different place from Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, he's on the inside. He's playing by the rules. He got himself elected. He has, represented Britain in the EU Parliament. So I guess you have to say that he is part of the inside, not the outside, in the way that Tommy Robinson has been
very much on the outside.
Yeah. Right. Rupert asks, why are the vast majority of populists right-wing? What's so unappealing about left-wing populism? I don't know that they are. I mean, I guess, the Maduro government of Venezuela is populist and very left-wing. I think we've seen the Cinque Stelle in Italy, left-wing populism, that came very close to power sort of, a decade or so ago. I wonder how useful it is even to do the left and right. That is the question we're always asking ourselves, isn't it? Is that, is the far right the same as the hard right, the same as the extreme right, or is populism a form of extremism, whichever sort of flavour it is?
You could argue that, was Jeremy Corbyn a left-wing populist? I mean, if we're arguing that Boris Johnson was a right-wing populist, I would say that Jeremy Corbyn was a populist of the left, and I'm sure people would disagree with this. But, so, for example, suddenly during the election campaign saying, we're going to give everybody free broadband without any much regard to what the cost of that would be and whether people needed free broadband, you would say, well, that was a populist measure at the time.
Well, it was a brilliant bit of the manifesto. I think everyone's thinking, why didn't they do it?
But then you get...
I don't know that makes you a populist.
No, but then you kind of...
I think populism is about how you come to and retain power, and it normally means through authoritarian means. I think it's not about having popular policies. I don't think it's about popular policies. It's about how you wield and how you access power.
Okay, that's a narrow definition of populism. I would say that what marks out populism, and seeing it in America under Trump, is the idea that there are simple solutions to complex problems, and you gull the electorate into believing that if only you did that, then it would all be sorted. And so for example, you look at reform of what they were saying, or even sometimes some of the Green policies at the general election. We can raise £175 billion to spend on something different if only we did this to welfare benefits. And
no, actually, to be fair, the Greens don't believe in Trident, right? Yeah. So if you got rid of your nuclear deterrent, you've got a hell of a lot of cash to spend on whatever you like.
But there was I would say a naivety about the world and Britain's place in the world to be asking to do that. All I'm saying is I think that what marks out populism is the idea that it's really simple. And, simple, we can just release billions of pounds to spend on something different if only we stopped X, Y or Z. And I think that the world is a more complicated place than that, and it wouldn't be that easy to do that. And I think that the tough thing for democratic politicians of the mainstream is to say, you know what? It's tricky. And I think that's why probably Starmer has done quite well at the moment by saying, you know what, we're going to under-promise and hopefully over-deliver. But because these are complex issues and there are a lot of problems to sort out.
Yeah. Okay. Lucy from London, or maybe your whole name is Lucy London. I apologise. It probably is Lucy London, actually. That's what we're doing, not saying where people
Lucy,
are from.
will you let us know, please, whether you're Lucy from London or Lucy London?
Ms London, how should the Labour government tackle male violence in society, and what has happened to make the UK full of so many angry, young and old men? Oh, God, Lucy, where to start? You will know the facts that a woman is killed by a man every 3 days in the UK, that domestic abuse makes up 18% of all recorded crime in England and Wales. And I think the first step is to recognise in the way that we talk about and report domestic violence that we say it for what it is. We don't just say, a woman's been killed after a domestic. We say she is the victim of her husband's violence. I think it's really important that we make that distinction, that we ask the question. There's been a huge amount of work on the links between terrorists, actual, convicted terrorists, and the initial crimes that they committed. There is so much domestic violence that becomes the initial, as it were, the gateway crime to then acts of terror. And so I would be thinking very carefully about how we report these crimes, how we look at the sort of past records of people who've gone on to commit serious crimes. We're doing a whole re-examination, aren't we now, of whether we talk about flashing, whether we talk about exposing, or whether we actually say, sexual offences start there. Sexual offences are when you show your genitalia to a woman you don't know on the tube or anywhere. We actually have to call it by its name and not sort of minimise stuff that makes us slightly embarrassed.
I think that the changes that have been wrought in society, I think I agree with absolutely everything you say. I mean, 4 decades ago, when I started my career in local radio, and you'd get into work at sort of 4:30 in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, and you would ring round the local police stations to find out whether they've got anything for us from overnight, which might make a news story for the morning bulletin. And you'd say, you'd speak to them, and they say, well, there was a grievous bodily harm. And you go, oh, really? And yeah, it was only a domestic. And that was the attitude of the authorities, that it's only a domestic, i.e. it just happens behind someone's closed door, and therefore it doesn't really concern wider society. I mean, I think that attitude has changed, and is changing, and still needs to change.
But still, if you look at the number of convictions we get for rape, right, it is so minimal that I would say I have probably 3 girlfriends who have been raped, and none have gone to the police. Not because they don't trust the police, but because they don't trust the system to do anything, and it will ruin their lives without getting any convictions. If we started treating rape as domestic violence, if we started actually treating it not as a he says, she said, but as a form of actual male violence, I think that would be the first step on the road as well.
Fascinating question. Lucy, thank you very much for that. We'll be back in just a moment. Before we go, a question from Nicola Reynolds. If anything were to happen to Biden health-wise between now and January, and Harris had to take over, would that short stint count as her first term? And then if she wins and gets re-inaugurated in January, would that be her second term? And she therefore wouldn't be allowed to stand again in 2028? It's a great question. The answer is it would not count as a first term. If you think of what happened in 1963 with JFK...
And LBJ.
LBJ gets sworn in as president. He wins the election in 64 by a landslide, introduces all sorts of very positive reforms.
Civil Rights
Act, fair voting, all the rest of it, into the US, and could have stood again in 68. But as we were discussing, chose not to, a la Joe Biden, and said, I'm standing down now. So it would be perfectly possible for Kamala Harris, if anything happened to Biden, to run in November, and that would be her first term, and she'd be able to run again.
You use JFK as your template. I use Veep. We learned all that from Veep.
Really?
Exactly. You can, because obviously she comes by the presidency, inadvertently, and then she runs for her first term when she kind of stands to be re-elected. So you get 2 terms plus whatever happened that put you in there first of all.
I do worry that probably more of our listeners know about Selina Meyer than they do about Lyndon Baines Johnson.
I wouldn't worry about that. I think that's great.
Fantastic.
That's really good.
We'll see you next week. We won't see you next week, but I'll see you next week.
We will see you on the US version, and I will leave you to keep the pot boiling.
Simmering nicely
for August.
See you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.